Mom had once warned Mark not to listen in to other people's conversations. "You might hear something you wish you hadn't," she had said. Now Mark was beginning to think she was right. Not that he had meant to listen in to this conversation. Things had just worked out that way. The rest of the class was already out on the playing field, but he had been delayed because he had been rummaging around in his sports bag looking for 2 matching socks. In the end he had given up and was now wearing 1 blue and 1 white. As he bent down to do up his trainers, he had heard someone come back into the changing room and confront the PE teacher. "Mr. Knox, why have you dropped Sam from our relay team?" It was Stephen, and he sounded annoyed. "For a very good reason. Sam isn't here. If he decides to go off on holiday to Spain during the 2 weeks when we're practicing for the district sports, then I'm afraid he loses his place." "But, sir," objected Stephen. "It was his parents who booked the holiday, and he'll be back before sports day. He's our best sprinter by miles." "I know that, Stephen, but the relay is a team event, and you need to practice working together as a team. I've chosen Mark to replace Sam. He's a decent runner, and he's proved himself on the rugby pitch to be a good team player. What's more, he always turns up for practice, which is more than can be said of our Sam. Sam's way faster than Mark. We've no chance without him," moaned Stephen. "There's more to sport than natural talent, Stephen." Conversation over. "My decision is final." Mr. Knox and Stephen left the changing room. Mark knelt behind the bench for a minute or 2 longer, thinking over what he'd just heard. On the one hand he was excited, he'd love to compete in the district sports. He wasn't a bad athlete, but there were always a couple of boys who were better than him, which ruled him out of being chosen for an individual event. The 4x100-meter relay was his only hope. On the other hand, he felt gutted that Stephen was so against him being on the team. When he was sure that the others were well ahead, Mark went out onto the playing field. It was a sunny afternoon. The hurdles and the high jump were already set up, and Mr. Knox's voice drifted across from the long jump pit, telling Chris to stop messing about with the rake. Mark sauntered along, soaking up the atmosphere. Nothing could compare with the sound of studs on tarmac as the team jogged out onto the rugby pitch, or with the thrill of scoring a try, but this had to be a close second. Suddenly his daydream was interrupted by Mr. Knox shouting at him. "Mark! Where have you been? I've been looking for you." Mark sprinted over to Mr. Knox. He pretended to be surprised when he heard that he was to be part of the relay team. He also pretended not to notice how put out Stephen was. That was more difficult, as Stephen was doing nothing to hide his feelings. Mr. Knox organized a race between the 4 team members. Mark ran as fast he ever had in his life. He had a lot to prove. Stephen won, of course. Andy was second. That was to be expected, too. But it would have been hard to say whether Josh or Mark came third. "Well done," said Mr. Knox. "Good speed from you all, there. But now I want you to focus on baton passes. This is where many a race has been lost. Remember, if you don't receive the baton within your box or if you step out of your lane, you will be disqualified." For the rest of the afternoon the boys practiced passing the baton to one another. "It has to be right," insisted Mr. Knox. "Hold it like this. Pass it like this. Don't drop it, whatever you do. Know exactly when to start running. And don't forget to come back on Monday after school for more practice. We only have 2 weeks, you know. I'm in the 4x100-meter relay team for the district sports, announced Mark as soon as he got home. Fantastic, said Mom. You don't seem all that excited about it. Of course I am, said Mark almost crossly, but then he sat down at the kitchen table and told her all about how he had overheard Mr. Knox and Stephen. I don't like being on a team when someone else doesn't want me there. And I'm worried about what Sam's going to say when he comes back from Spain. Mum understand that. But at the end of the day, Mr. Knox is the one to choose the team and he knows a lot about how team work. He sees you as a good team player. You could have 4 of the fastest sprinters on a team and they could still lose if they had never learned to work well together. I'm sure Stephen will come round all right when he sees how dedicated you are to the team. I hope so, said Mark doubtfully. It was turning out to be a busy month. Apart from athletics practice, teachers were starting to talk about revising for tests, and the youth group at church had organized a special program. All the young people had been divided into teams. Anyone in the congregation who wanted a job done could ask one of these teams to do it for them. The youth group leaders thought it would be a good idea for the young people to help the older members and maybe get to know them better at the same time. And if the job was well done, donations would be gratefully received towards the youth group's project. They were collecting money for street children in Colombia. The phone rang early on Saturday morning. At least, Mark thought it was early. It woke him up. Amy barged into his bedroom to tell him that Adam was on the phone and wanted to speak to him. Mark heaved himself out of bed. Adam was one of the leaders at youth group. What could he want at this time in the morning? Hello, Mark, came Adam's cheery voice. I'm just phoning round everyone in our work team to see how you're all fixed. We have a job for today. Have you anything planned? Don't think so, said Mark foggily. Great, I'll pick you up in half an hour, then. Exactly half an hour later Adam arrived. Chris was in the front seat of his car. Mark squeezed into the back beside Harry and Philip and a huge watering can which Philip had brought with him. Mark wanted to tell Philip to shove up a bit, but Philip had learning difficulties, so he didn't. He was never quite sure what to say to Philip. That's our team complete, said Adam, starting up the engine. Where are we going? Asked Mark. You promised to tell us when we were all here, reminded Chris. We're all here now. We're all here now, said Philip excitedly. Our mission, said Adam mysteriously, is to conquer a wild jungle. Whose garden do we have to tide? Asked Chris. He sounded less than excited. Mrs. Davidson's. Everyone looked blank. You know, second row from the back. Blue coat, cream hat. We're going to tide up a lady's garden, Philip. Philip bounced up and down. The watering can bounced up and down too. I wish he'd move over a bit, thought Mark again. Without her blue coat and cream hat, Mrs. Davidson looked completely different. For a start, she was a lot younger than Mark had always imagined. To everyone's amazement, she knew Mark and Philip and Harry by name. She had never met Chris before, but she wanted to know all about him. Chris, she said. I'll remember you too. Adam's description of Mrs. Davidson's garden as a wild jungle had not been far off the mark. My husband was a keen gardener. I'm glad he can't see how badly I have neglected things. It's all got rather out of hand, and I couldn't see how I was ever going to get on top of it again. I am so grateful to you fine young people. You are a real answer to prayer. On the way to the tool shed, Chris grinned. I've never been called an answer to prayer before. I think she really meant it, said Adam. Oh, I know she did. Let's get going. Adam smiled to himself. Mrs. Davidson had certainly won Chris round. If Mrs. Davidson felt that she had neglected the garden, she certainly needed to have no worries about the tool shed. Every tool was polished and hanging in its own place. Right, said Adam. Who knows anything about gardening? Mark and Harry looked at each other. We both cut the grass at home, volunteered Harry. Please let me cut the grass. Please, please, begged Philip. Adam looked round at the garden. We need one to cut the grass, two to weed the beds, one to prune back those bushes, and one to sweep the paths. Would you like to sweep, Philip? Let me cut the grass, Adam. Please. I can do a good job. Philip was not to be talked out of it. Okay. Harry gave in at last. I'll weed, but someone will have to help me. I don't know the difference between a weed and a plant. I'll show you, said Adam. Anyone know anything about pruning? Chris volunteered for that job. That left Mark to be the sweeper. And the wheelbarrow pusher, the grass box emptier, the branch gatherer, in fact, the general dog's body, he thought moodily as he watched Philip out of the corner of his eye. What a mess he's making. Philip's job was not an easy one. The grass had not been cut for weeks. Adam had shown him how to walk up and down in straight lines, but Philip was small and the old push mower was heavy. Every so often he stopped to wipe his face, and to tell the others how hot he was and how well he felt he was doing. Adam praised him, and Chris joined in, but the others just looked at each other and rolled their eyes. Halfway through the morning, Mrs. Davidson called the boys into her kitchen for something to eat and drink. They were all glad of a break, and glad of the nice cold drinks and chocolate chip cookies waiting on the table for them. Only Philip refused to come in, not until he had finished his job. Never mind, said Mrs. Davidson. He can have something when he's finished. She put a few cookies aside on another plate for him. He's working so hard. You all are. My garden looks so much better already. Adam looked out of the kitchen window. I'm afraid you're not going to have the lovely bowling garden stripes Mr. Davidson was so proud of. Suddenly there was a loud crash from the garden. Oh, dear, said Mrs. Davidson, and there was a slight tremble in her voice. Perhaps I ought to have moved the bird bath. It was indeed the bird bath which Philip had sent crashing to the ground. It lay on the path in 3 pieces. I'm sorry, said Philip. So you should be, thought Mark. Don't worry, said Mrs. Davidson kindly. It was an accident, and I'm sure it can be easily repaired. But Mark could tell that she was upset. The bird bath had obviously been important to her. By lunchtime there was still work to be done on the garden. We could meet up on Thursday evening to finish off, suggested Adam. Not Thursday. I'll not be back from the district sports, objected Mark. Well, if it suits the rest of us, began Chris, but Adam interrupted him. We're working as a team, so we'll come back next Saturday morning when we can all be there. He gathered up the broken pieces of the bird bath. He was sure he had some strong glue at home which would stick it back together. As they left, Mrs. Davidson thanked them over and over and gave them a donation for the Colombian children. Don't forget to let me know how that little boy gets on. You know, the one who had the operation on his foot, she said. Amy was setting the table for lunch when Mark arrived home. Mum had gone away with some friends for the whole day. That felt strange. Mum was always around on Saturday. Mark went over to the kitchen sink to wash his hands. He started to tell Amy about his morning. I think Adam should have let me or Harry cut the grass. I don't mean to be nasty, but you should have seen the mess Philip made. But you are being nasty, said Amy hotly. I'm sure he did his best. It's not his fault if he's not as good at things as other people. You complained enough when Stephen didn't want you on his team. You're just as bad. Dad came in the back door at that point. He had been hanging out washing on the line. What's all this about? He asked as he dished out the baked beans for lunch. Amy thinks I'm being mean about Philip, but all I'm trying to say is that we could have had that job completely finished if Philip hadn't been on your team, finished Dad. But do you think that's the right way to look at things? Isn't Philip as much part of the church as any of the rest of us? He loves Jesus and he wants to be involved as much as you do. Every Christian has some job to do and everyone's effort is valuable. Doesn't it say somewhere in the Bible that we're like one big body and not everyone can be the eye because there would be no one left to be the ear? Asked Amy. Dad smiled. That's right. The Corinthian Christians were arguing about which was the most worthwhile gift to have, and so Paul wrote to them, pointing out that just as a human body is made up of many different parts, each one important in its own way, so the Christian church is made up of many people each with his or her own gift. Instead of spending their time squabbling over who was most important, he wanted them to value one another and work together for Christ's cause. Mark and Amy chased their beans around their plate and exchanged amused glances as Dad tried to prise apart some slices of frozen bread to put in the toaster. It's good advice, he went on. You young ones were able to be useful to Mrs. Davidson this morning, but do you know what she's been doing for you for years? Mark and Amy shook their heads. She has a list of all the children born in our church and she has been praying through her list since the day they were born. Now there's a valuable work. Dad stopped talking and put a forkful of beans in his mouth. And something else, he said. Something we don't appreciate the job someone else is doing until we try to do it ourselves. Everyone burst out laughing. He had been so busy with the washing that he had forgotten to heat the beans. They were stone cold. On Thursday morning Mum called Mark an hour earlier than usual. Mark looked at his clock and wondered why. Then he remembered it was the day of the district sports. The minibus will leave the school at 8 o'clock sharp, Mr. Knox had warned. Mark arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, but everyone else was already there. Mark could see it was important not to be late for things, but he never could understand why some people always liked to be so early. There was only one seat left on the bus, and that was beside Stephen, who looked rather pleased with himself. Wait a minute, said Mark. Looked round. Andy's not here yet. We'd better wait. Andy was up all night being sick, Stephen informed him, so he can't come. Sam turned round from the seat in front. So I'm afraid you have me on the team, after all. The district sports was a much bigger event than the school sports day. A confident voice over a loudspeaker announced the various events, adding in lots of statistics about past winners and their schools which Mark and his friends had never even heard of. In between announcements, the voice reminded the competitors of the regulations on where to go, and when to go, and of how to behave at an athletic event. Mark felt his stomach beginning to knot up. He wished Andy was there. Mark was the third to run in the relay team, and Andy was fourth. They had practiced their baton change so often that it was more or less perfect every time, but he had never practiced with Sam. "Sam," ventured Mark, "how about a quick practice with the baton?" Sam went on watching the senior boys high jump. "There's nothing to that. Anyway, I'll be called any minute now for the 100-meter sprint." Sam waiting for the starter's pistol didn't look as unbeatable as Sam back at home. Each boy here was the fastest in his school. Each one was determined to come first. They were off. "Go for it, Sam," yelled Mark. "He's done it," cheered Stephen. Sam won. "We're a dead cert to win the relay now." The team's turn came at last. Mark felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The pistol shot rang out, and Stephen shot off. Seconds later Mark saw Josh pounding towards him. He turned and held his hand behind him. Now the baton was his. He heard it singing as he raced towards Sam. One boy to his left, neck and neck. Sam would soon sort that. Sam! What was Sam doing? He had started to run, but he was looking behind him, and where was his hand? Where did he expect Mark to put the baton? The two boys fumbled. Finally Sam had the baton and he was sprinting towards the finishing line, leaving the others far behind. A cheer went up, but Mark stood where he was, catching his breath, and wondering. The confident voice made an announcement. The winners of the junior boys 4x100-meter relay are the Edward Cook School. Torgrove School has been disqualified. "I knew it," muttered Mark. "Sam stepped over the line when I was passing him the baton." On the journey home the atmosphere in the bus was tense. Sam was happy enough. He had come first in the 100m and the 200m and second in the high jump. Overall Torgrove had done well, and Mr. Knox was pleased. But Stephen was furious and, as usual, he was letting his feelings show. "That Sam," he complained, "all he cares about is his individual performance. He couldn't care less about his team." "Why didn't he practice the baton change with you, Mark?" "I heard you asking him to." Mark shrugged. He was disappointed, of course he was. But he was used to playing on a team. Sometimes you made mistakes. Sometimes someone else did. You just had to get used to it. It was all part and parcel of being a team. Maybe that applied to this team too, thought Mark, as he climbed into Adam's car on Saturday morning. Philip and his watering can were there again. And the bird bath, well repaired by Adam. Mrs. Davidson was pleased to see the team back and delighted with her bird bath. She said that the birds had been missing it, and filled it up with water. This week Adam gave everyone a different job. Mark put on the leather gloves and snipped back overgrown branches with the secateur. Philip was the dog's body, and he was just as enthusiastic a dog's body as he had been a grass cutter. Mark watched as he wheeled away a barrow load of twigs, spilling at least half of Team on the way. At least he came back later to gather them up. Somehow, Mark felt more patient with him today. The boys worked hard. At last Chris threw down his fork. "Do you think Mrs. Davidson's forgotten about our drinks?" He sauntered over towards the back door, whistling loudly. Nothing happened. Philip, suddenly realizing that he was really very hungry and thirsty, bounded down the garden, and peered in the kitchen window. "Mrs. Davidson's lying on the floor," he shouted. Hearing the commotion at her kitchen window, Mrs. Davidson tried to pull herself up on one elbow and explain what had happened. It was hard to hear her through the glass, but it seemed that she had split some juice on the floor and slipped. She couldn't get up. And she was lying behind the back door, so no one could open it. Suddenly she moaned in pain. Adam took charge. "We'll have to phone an ambulance and we'll have to open the front door." "But how?" Harry ran round the house, looking for open windows. Chris was convinced that the best thing to do was to take the back door off its hinges. Mark tapped on the window again. "Does a neighbor have a key?" he mouthed to Mrs. Davidson, but she shook her head weakly. "What now?" Harry came back round the side of the house. "The only open window is that little pane in the bathroom," he said, and everyone looked up. What they saw made them gasp. Philip had already spotted the open window. It was just above an old coal shed, which was joined onto the house and had a steep roof, and Philip was halfway up the roof. "Philip," said Adam, "do you think that's a wise idea?" Philip grabbed hold of the ridge tiles at the top of the roof and looked over his shoulder at the others on the ground below. "I think it's a brilliant idea. I'm good at climbing, and I'm skinny enough to get through the window. Then I'll run downstairs and open the door." "Be very careful," said Adam. What else could he say? It was as dangerous to come back as it was to go on. "I go to lessons at the climbing wall, you know," boasted Philip. "But you have ropes there," Mark reminded him. Philip threw one leg over the ridge tiles so that he was sitting astride the roof. Then he bounced himself along until he reached the wall of the house. The bathroom window still was almost a meter above him, and the open pane was at the top of the window. "He'll never do it," said Harry. "Watch me," shouted Philip, and suddenly he was standing on the window sill. Another few seconds and he was disappearing headfirst through the window. There was a crash. Moments later, Philip's outline appeared behind the frosted glass of the bathroom window, holding up the two halves of a broken plant pot. "Sorry," he yelled. It wasn't long until the ambulance arrived, and Mrs. Davidson was taken off to hospital. She had a fractured hip, and it was several weeks before she was able to come home. Adam's team visited her. When she heard about how Philip had climbed in through her bathroom window, she put her hands over her face. "Well, I'm glad I wasn't watching that, but I am also glad that you did it. I was praying that God would send someone to rescue me, but I had no idea there was such an agile climber in the team. I don't know who else could have done what you did, Philip." The day Mrs. Davidson was to come home, her house was full of people. Some of the ladies in the church were there to clean, others were stocking up the freezer, or arranging flowers. Of course, Adam's team was busy getting the garden into shape. "Whose turn is it to cut the grass?" asked Adam. "Philip can do it," offered Mark, although he really wanted to do it himself. He wanted to see if he could produce those bowling green stripes. "Sorry," said Philip. "I have something important to do." He was standing beside the water tap filling up his enormous, green watering can. "At long last, you're going to use that thing. I thought you only brought it to give us all less room in the car." Philip put his finger over the tap and squirted water at Mark. Mark rushed over and squirted him back. "The way you do to one of your team,"